All right, today I want to talk to you about Claude. For those of you who have read John Maxwell's 21 Laws of Leadership, you know who Claude is, hopefully. For those who haven't, here's a book recommendation for you. Please go out and get 21 Laws of Leadership by John Maxwell, one of the best books on leadership that I've ever read. And so we went through this book a long time ago, back when the book was actually cassettes that we listened to. But in the book, 21 Laws of Leadership, the second law, the law of influence, John Maxwell talks about this guy named Claude. And the story goes, so spoiler alert in case you haven't read it, but the story goes that John Maxwell's a pastor. He took over a church in rural Indiana, and young, go-getter pastor and wanting to come in and impact change at the church. And he noticed at his elder meetings, if that's what they're called then, that whenever he would bring up something for change, everybody in around the table would look at this farmer named Claude, and they'd look for Claude's reaction and response to change before they gave their reaction and response. And if Claude was on board with it, everything got voted yes, and they did the change. If Claude wasn't on board with it, then nobody else was on board with it either, and it didn't get done. And so Maxwell figured out that even though he's got a room of people there, he has a key influencer by the name of Claude. And so what he did, which is really smart, is he started to visit Claude on the weekends out at his farm, and he'd help him do some work around there. And he would start to bring up with Claude some of the ideas that he wanted to get done around the church. And he would then, at that time, Claude may ask some questions. He could explain the why to him, and kind of talk through some things. And many times Claude would then kind of see it and could get on board with it. And so then, after he talked with Claude, he'd bring it up at the next elder meeting, and people would look to Claude, and Claude would be like, "Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We should do that," whatever it was. And so he learned a very valuable lesson, which is the law of influence. And so in that case, it was Claude. And so what I want you as leaders to do is to think about your teams and who is the influencer on your team. Who is the person that when you bring up something new and that people look to get their reaction first? For me, it was funny because, again, this was years ago, and right after we had learned this lesson, I looked at my team and I immediately identified who Claude was on my team. And my Claude was Mark Thomas, who's now my chief revenue officer. And at the time, I was a sales manager, and Mark was my top producing sales rep that I have. And Mark's a great guy, blunt, loud, fun, just like you would expect a head of sales to be. And I love Mark to death. And I remember back in the day when I would bring up different ideas of things I wanted to do with the team, and they would be on our weekly huddles. We would have conference calls on Monday mornings, like teams still do here. And without going over things with Mark first, I might bring something up. And if Mark didn't know the why behind it or didn't necessarily agree with it, he would ask questions about it. Well, I'm not sure that's a good idea for this or that. He wasn't necessarily on board. And what I found myself doing would be after the call, I would circle back and talk with Mark one-on-one, and I'd explain the why, which, by the way, is a key leadership lesson as well, explaining the why to people. I'd explain the why and talk with Mark about it, hear what his concerns were, and a lot of times once he understood the reason behind it, he would get on board. Oftentimes, I'd hear what Mark's concerns were, and we'd tweak the idea a little bit, and then do it. And so it all worked out well, but then I'd have to go back and follow up the members on my team and explain Mark and I are not, we're on the same page now, here's how we've tweaked the idea, and let's do this. And it usually got done, but it took a lot of time and energy and effort to do that. And so after going through the 21 laws and hearing the Claude story, it occurred to me, Mark's my Claude. So what I started doing was going to Mark first with any ideas I had for change. And Mark and I would have the same conversation we had before on the back end, but now we do it on the front end. And we talked through the ideas, and I explained the why. I'd hear where Mark's perspective was, which was very valuable perspective because he was the one in the field and who the change would impact. And so I needed to hear that perspective from him. We'd get on the same page, and then we'd bring it to the team. And once I did that, Mark would always be the first one to speak up, be like, "Yep, I think that's a great idea for this reason or that reason," and he'd explain the why to people, and people would be like, "Yep, we're on board." So I mean this. So I took the idea of Claude that Maxwell talks about in 21 Laws, and in real life, found out who my Claude was, applied the law of influence, which is to get them on board first and then go forward, and it worked like magic. It was awesome, and I've always kept that with me. And even just here at Service Express recently, popping in on a new and emerging leaders training that we do, I told this story about Claude and the story about Mark and how we used it. And so look around your teams and find out who the influencer is. Now, with me, Mark just happened to be the top producing person on my team. A lot of times they are the top producer, but not always. Sometimes there's somebody else that's respected on the team, or somebody who's a veteran who's been around for a long time. It may not always be the top producer. It's usually, what I have found, it's not the lowest producer. Typically, if it's the lowest producer, they tend to be more of a cancer, honestly, because they tend to be fighting everything you do, and they're not producing, and they're dragging the team down with them. And you got to deal with that on a whole different level. They're typically, though, they are a producer, maybe the top producer, but they're the person that influences the rest of the team for whatever reason. And so find out who that is. As you're trying to impact change and grow and evolve, get with them first, get them on your team, explain the why to them, and that time spent up front will save you, in my personal experience, will save you probably 10 times the amount of time on the back end having to follow up with everybody. So try it. Would love to hear what you think about it, and go for it.